Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here. Today, I'm going to talk about building a test strategy for organizational transformation. And as Tomas told, it's about a marriage between a startup and a huge corporation. So, a bit about me. I'm celebrating 15 years in QA. Sorry I didn't bring cake, but that's fine, I hope. 37 years old, Utrecht, the Netherlands, as Thomas also mentioned. I've done a lot of projects, but most of them are in the e-commerce domain, which also ties in a bit about this startup that I was asked to work at, because they were in the e-commerce payments. So let me tell you about a story. It's based on a true story. Some things might be fictional, and with that disclaimer out of the way, I can now actually tell you what was actually going on. So, the situation. A huge American global payments company, they actually bought a small startup in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam company, they created a software that processed online payments. And the big corporation had, they were seeking out a tool that could actually be the center of their online payments in Europe and later on globally. So it completely made sense that they bought a small startup in Amsterdam that was doing this with 2 Scrum teams. Now, that is of course a marriage that not necessarily is working out on paper. There's 2 different types of processes, different levels of quality, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because those issues needed to be resolved and they hired me as their QA lead. So that's the start of our story today. When I came in, there were different kind of problems that I needed to face and address and hopefully solve. Some of them were that the releases were inconsistent. They had suffered from production issues as well. So the level of quality of their releases was not of the expected level that they actually were hoping for online payments where, everything should go right. Also, the fit in the corporate landscape with many teams, release boards, and monthly releases, that was a world apart from where the startup was, where they had bi-weekly sprints and actually released to production every time. So we needed to define a QA strategy that married those 2 processes together. Also, the local teams, they needed to grow. As I mentioned, they only started with 2 Scrum teams, but there was a huge workload coming their way to actually become this global operator inside of this huge corporation. So the local teams needed to grow, and we needed to spread the way of working of our small startup, which had really good stuff, into that huge corporation process. Cool. So we need to fix the QA strategy problem. What are we going to work towards? One thing that I am very adamant about in Scrum is that we work with automation first, because manual testing cannot keep up with the speed of releases in Scrum. So that's also why we needed to get the automation back in shape, and also the landscape, the architectural landscape was changing from a monolithic application to multiple microservices. So that's something that we needed to adapt to. The test environments were shaky at best. They were not really reliable, and we actually ran into some problems where the test cases were failing incorrectly, and we can't really trust them. So that's definitely something that we need to pick up. There was a big focus on component testing. And with microservices, it's very important, of course, to also test your integrations between those services. So the right mindset was something that we needed to work on. The test pyramid was definitely not in shape. And also, we had core values and we had best practices. We were actually doing pretty well in the startup group of teams. However, it wasn't really documented. It was more of a feeling that they were doing right. So things that needed to be addressed with a formal QA strategy. The starting point, so I came in the small startup, and things were going the right way, as I mentioned. The developers, they had the right mindset of using TDD, and had a unit test coverage that was actually pretty good. There were not a lot of QA engineers. This was the second one in the 2 teams. We eventually grew, but yeah, with only 2 people for 2.5 Scrum teams, that's definitely under capacity for all the things that needed to happen. I was also working on a QA strategy, so I was a bit stretched out, right? So we needed to grow the team as well. And the functional automation was pretty much in shambles. Out of all the test cases that we had, only 30% was functional, and the rest was flaky. So we couldn't really rely on everything that was already there. Of course, there were some additional challenges, because why not? As I mentioned, there were only 2 of us in the QA team, but also the Scrum teams needed to grow, so that's something that we need to take care of. The collaboration with offshore teams, there were already teams, of course, working on online payments, but now we needed to integrate our way of working with them. And we needed to accommodate a QA strategy for the microservice architecture that was actually already incoming. So let's try and see how we can fix this, right? Tackling that challenge is what we're going to discuss next. Test strategies are very subjective. I think that there is going to be key components in there, but every QA lead, tester will have their own experience and bring in the best practices that they have seen and applied in different companies and different projects, right? So the following is the same. It is how I tried to address the problems that we've just seen in the way that I applied the learnings that I had over the past 15 years. So getting things on track. Automation first was very important for me, and also the team and teams agreed to that. So we did an analysis when we actually grew to a capacity of 3 or 4 QAs. We had the time to actually look at automation. So we did an analysis of what we had. We were working with a Java-based Selenium framework called Serenity BDD. It had the test cases written down in BDD Gherkin style, so everybody could read it and it would be implemented. The functional test automation language was not the same as the application language, and that is somewhat of a best practice that I'd like to adhere to, because if you have the same language as the developers are writing, you can actually ask them to help with the automation, right? So for me, this was a reason not to keep with the same framework. However, Serenity BDD was chosen, rightfully so eventually, because it can handle the functional test cases, but with the inserted integration of REST assured, it can also handle API tests. So for us, it could actually cover a lot of the automation pyramid. And as the tool already existed, it was also already integrated in our pipelines. With the push of a button, we could run all the tests. We get a report out of there as well, because that's also one of the features of Serenity BDD. But also every build or every change on the code, our test automation scripts would run, and we would actually get feedback. So there were a lot of reasons why we actually decided to go against one of my best practices and keep the framework as it was. So we needed to start work and fix the failing tests and add coverage. So it's very important when you have a QA strategy to build that you think of spending your time the right way. You don't want to spend too much time on the things that are already working for you. So working our way from the things that are good to the things that are bad, this is where we spend least of our time, because these were easy wins, you know, low-hanging fruit. Again, the unit test coverage that we had was pretty good. I will not go into the exact number, because that's a discussion for another time. But we needed to make that part of the definition of ready, and also part of the acceptance criteria for our user story, so that everybody made sure that for every new developer that came in, for every new user story that we picked up, that we actually worked on that unit test coverage. The integration test documentation was going to be more important with the microservices architecture. So we also started focusing on that. We started implementing Postman, created test suites in there that we could run with the click of a button, that could be shared across teams, and that's also how we spread knowledge about which APIs were available. Also, the quality steps in the Scrum process were pretty good, but every team had their own way of working. Well, as the teams grew and new people came in, it was very important to make sure that you cement that everybody can read, this is what we do every time, every sprint, every release. So you get one expected level of quality. bring in the missing stuff. There will be gaps. There will be stuff that needs some help to actually start flying. This is where you spend a bit more time. Agreeing on a QA process is easy when it's only 2 Scrum teams, but when you actually start integrating and working with offshore teams or nearshore employees, it is very important that everybody knows which steps everybody's taking so you know what's coming up. Formalize that definition of done. It really helps by also increasing the stakeholders in this process, because they also want to know what level of quality their user stories are going to be delivered in when it's actually the end of the sprint and we're doing a demo, right? They know that it's been tested, they know which functional test cases have been covered. So that definition of done was something that we, across the board of teams in Amsterdam, we uniformized that and into one set of guidelines. And the automation best practices, we started off with 2 QA automation engineers, myself and the other guy. It's pretty easy to align best practices with 2 people, but as the team grew, eventually we had 10 QA engineers working on our framework. Is everybody using the same cases? Are people still applying explicit weights? So we had a bi-weekly meeting with the QA team to make sure that everybody was aligned in how we work, and actually that helped also with speeding up the test process, because we made sure that there was going to be selector elements in the UI, no explicit hard weights, so the automation would always go faster instead of just waiting for stuff that was hard-coded, right? This was pretty easy to do, but again, it's more work than just documenting the stuff that was going well. So that also means this is where we spend most of our time, right? A lot of stuff was holding us back from actually doing the things that we love to do, that we think were important. Test data. I saw a lot of hands yesterday at one of the talks that people are struggling with test data. It's a very hard subject, right? What we ran into is that we were using a test environment that was also used for manual tests, for checking of the developers. So some of our test data was actually used up, and that also caused some failures in the automation. We fixed that by creating our beloved automation environment, where we actually had a step in the build pipeline that would refresh the data every time we ran the automation. And that way we were sure that the data that we needed for our automated tests were available. The acceptance environment was not stable. Well, it used to be. You might think the acceptance environment is where actually stable products go, right? You're right, but that was not definitely something that the offshore teams believed. Their test environment was so convoluted and bad that they actually moved their developer tests to acceptance, which actually broke some of the core services that we were talking to after we integrated the microservices. And that meant that several times a month, for days at end, our tests would not be able to run on tests, on acceptance, on automation, because we were actually using the acceptance service. Some hard talks were done, and we aligned with the offshore development teams that, these are levels of standard that we actually expect. It can't happen that the acceptance environment is not available for your service, because it's so key to actually testing everything else. With that out of the way, we actually got back to better releases and more expected testing. So that was something that we definitely need to align to with, I think it was 8 to 10 teams. So not a small feat. And then the integrations, those were also a pain point, because if you expect a service to work, but it's not available, you need to start creating stubs. And it's nice to have stubs and mocks, but it's even better if you can actually do the integration at some point in time, right? So that was also one part of the discussion that we had with the offshore teams. With all of that out of the way, we sort of had a solid QA strategy. We were getting things on track, but the team also grew, and how do you get those people on board? Financial technology, how many of you have worked with financial technology and online payments? I see 3.5 hands, 4, 5, okay. It's not a lot, right? So it's a pretty complex program that we worked with. So we actually had onboarding programs and teachings every week that helped people understand what the things that we were testing. Having that understanding really helped us. Onboard them on the QA strategy that we just created, making sure that everybody's aligned with the quality that we deliver. Automation first was actually starting to fly when we had enough capacity, and the test automation framework was set up correctly. So that actually helped us by not testing manual anymore, but only creating test automation test cases. And those weekly QA meetings, we kept them going because the new people came in, they had questions about the framework, or somebody else had a good idea to implement in the test automation framework. I definitely advise you to come together as testers and align on this. So we're almost at the end. There are some few key takeaways that I hope that you take home today. Be smart with your time. Setting up a test strategy is going to take a lot of time, and eventually you need to be able to convince people that this is a good way and time well spent. Keep the good things, bring the missing things, and reinvent the broken things. The QA strategy needed to be shared. Again, you want to have one expected level of quality. Everybody wants those nice releases that have been tested, the stakeholders that can actually read the BDD test cases. Everybody knows what's happening. Everybody eventually understood that if we follow this to the letter, we actually get better releases, less rework in our sprints, more time to do the cool stuff, right? And the last thing that I want to share with you is automation first sounds nice. It is important, but it's not easy. There's a lot of things that are required to make this happen and make this fly. Test environments, test data, coding practices, collaboration. So, this is where you're probably going to spend most of your time, but this is also where you gain a lot of time when you get it right. Automation will work for you, and with the time that you save, you get to do the cool stuff. Exploratory testing, as some of the other talks are talking about, right? So that's the presentation that I have for you today, and if you have any questions, they're more than welcome. Thanks.
Works. Thank you, Roman. Martijn, thank you very much. Pronunciation is important. Yes, we have a couple of questions already. Okay. So the first one is, did you keep definition of done limited to user stories, or it's also doable for tasks and bugs?
Could you repeat the last part?
Yes. Did you keep definition of done limited to user stories, or is it also doable for tasks and bugs?
When I'm in a team, I actually advocate for neither. I make sure that the definition of done is an artifact inside of your Scrum process. It is something that every user story, every task, every bug is held against. Every delivery in your sprint, I believe, should be held against the definition of done, because that's how you get one level of expected quality. So that's how I would approach that. That's also how we did it. It's just every team has one definition of done. Every part of the organization, so we also had a definition of done for the Amsterdam team. You trickle that down, and some teams might have some small tweaks. We had one team that, for example, that was heavy on UI. They had different acceptance criteria, different steps in the definition of done than teams that were fully backend or just small services. So,
okay, thank you very much. The next question is, you have mentioned that there was different framework used by developers and testers, and you were contemplating whether to switch or not, and then decided not to in order to have progress. So the question is, how did you manage to go? Do you plan to switch framework in the future? The same programming language what developers are using? If so, would you migrate? Oh, the questions are changing. Would you migrate the existing test cases later on?
Yeah, so good question, and that's something we definitely debated on. One thing that I didn't tell you is that my fellow QA engineers were only proficient in Java. I was one of the few who also wanted to work in TypeScript, so there was a bit of a fight that I didn't win. if you make a migration from test framework to a different language of test framework, there's some things that you can keep. If you work in BDD, the BDD test cases are of course easily copyable and a good way to start building your framework in a different language. Something else that I advocate for is when you're doing UI testing, that you have selector components. Selectors in the UI that your test automation can find wherever it is on the page that also make your automation scripting much easier. But those things are in place when you're switching a test framework, but still are testing the same application, right? So those helper elements are also helping you on the other side of the puzzle. So that's how I would benefit from that.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Steve Watson. How did you manage to get time to implement test improvement when still needing to deliver new features to production?
Yeah, it's a good question. It also dials into what I have heard at other talks during HUSTEF this year, that the conversation needs to be about making sure that the release is good, that you don't want to spend time on rework, that you're not going faster just for the sake of delivering it, but actually spend time of making it better. So you need to be the advocate and say, well, we actually want to spend more time now, because if we need to go back to this issue when everybody's moved on from this feature, it will take us way more time to investigate and to solve, to test again. So that is the conversation, that I would want to keep for that.
Thank you. Next question from Elena. You have mentioned some of the solutions were not your best practices. Did you undergo some initial struggle, or was it easy to accept?
What's the last thing?
So you have mentioned some of the solutions were not your best practices. Yeah. Did you undergo some initial struggle, or was it easy to accept? Internal struggle. Sorry.
Yeah, it's mostly an internal struggle. I think as a servant leader, you need to choose what's best for the company, what's best for your team. So I could definitely step over the fact that we were not working in TypeScript. We could not ask the developers for help because I want to help my team build automation, because that will help us in the end with all the testing that we want to do. So yeah, it's mostly an internal struggle instead of something that I really fought for. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question. How static is or was the test strategy? Do you think the team evolving it after you were gone?
I don't think it's set in stone. I do believe that it will change and probably has changed since I moved on a year ago. But I have seen it work. I have seen the stakeholders and business and managers actually see us deliver right the first time. They saw that it actually works. They looked at us for help. Another thing that happened along the way is that we aligned with the offshore development teams to actually adopt the test automation framework that we had fixed, because it was very close to their framework, but it missed some things like integration in the pipeline, reporting, other stuff. Plus, they were also adopting our microservices as part of their test plan. So they could also reuse some of our test cases as we onboarded them on our test framework. So there was definitely shows that everybody saw that this was the right way. Again, companies are fluid, and who knows what brought them in a year that they needed to adapt to. But I think I set them up for success. So.